Welcome to everyone here in London and to those joining us online. I'm Angus Armstrong, Director of Rebuilding Macroeconomics here at the Institute of Global Prosperity, UCL. We're a research network with about 80 working papers on our website, over half of which are published in peer-reviewed journals. And we teach graduate students, we start again a week today actually, with a PhD program as well. And we interact with policymakers. And we're very pleased to be co-hosting this conference this afternoon with the Coalition Castile Climate Action, the World Bank's C3A. The objective of C3A is to convene finance ministries to provide a policy forum on climate action. Now, the way we're going to hold the event today is I will host the first part and then pass over to my colleague, William Hines, who's in Paris, also at the World Bank, who will host the second half. A couple of housekeeping rules, just in case. Don't expect a fire alarm, so there is one yet. Secondly, this event is going to be recorded, so if anybody has any, please let me or William know, and we will try and down. And finally, to those people, especially online, if you have questions, please post them in the Q&A box on Zoom, and we'll try and interspace those with questions from the audience. Please feel free to ask questions as we go through. The subject of today's conference is green industrial policy, and it always has been really an issue about whether we should be doing one, since if we go back 200 odd years, Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations said that defense more important than opulence, and defending ourselves from the consequences of climate degradation is very obvious. Governments want to do. How we do it is something of considerable controversy. How do we encourage societies to make this transition? What are the contexts that we practice with, whether it's global geopolitics, those issues of inequality, fiscal debt situation, and finally, what are the right frameworks with which we should think about this transition and industrial policies? Fortunately, I don't have to come up with any of the answers. That's for our speakers and for the audience. And our first speaker is well known to everyone, so he's very little, but I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Dani Rodrik, who is Professor of International Political Economy at Harvard Kennedy School, President of the International Economic Association, and an author of many books, probably most famous full book, Has Globalization Gone Too Far, which I think was an extraordinary mention. Most recent book is Straight Talk on Trade, and I have to admit, as one of Dani's former students, he's also a fantastic, clear communicator. We're very lucky to have him with us. Dani is going to speak for 10 to 15 minutes and take a few questions. So anybody who has questions, and I have to be quick, I'm going to take the first 3 or 4 early. So I am very pleased to pass the floor to Dani. And Dani, I look forward to hearing what.
Thank you very much, Angus. It's a great pleasure to be with you, albeit virtually and online. I think, as Angus mentioned, the real question about industrial policy has always been not whether, but how. And I think it's very good now to see that the world's policymakers and technocrats and politicians are also have settled on that question. I think the question of whether we should be engaged in industrial policy is not one that is being asked. The question is, how should we do it? But our topic is green industrial policy, and I think the obvious thing to start out with here is the remarkable success that we've had recently in creating a new technological environment whereby renewables and green industries have become much more competitive than they have. You're all familiar with the dramatic decline in the costs of renewable energy, solar and wind in particular. But this really goes beyond solar and wind to EVs and batteries and a range of other green products, and really has produced, I think, a kind of a new optimism about our green transition, that this might be feasible. It's really remarkable that what has been achieved in renewable energy and the deployment of renewable sources of energy has been much more extensive than anyone really had anticipated. So you can go back to all the projections about the cost of solar and sort of the magnitude of installations and so forth, and consistently they underestimated how quickly this was going to happen. Well, behind this technological revolution is really largely industrial policy in one country, China. Interestingly, both the initial technologies in solar and wind, as well as the initial forays into industrial policy in this area, started out not in China. It was in Europe, Germany and Spain and so forth, but it was really China that took this forward over the last 10, 15 years. It's also important to understand that Chinese industrial policy really goes way beyond subsidies. I think it would be very mistaken to think about this as purely just sort of going out and paying a whole bunch of subsidies to producers. I think the way that this has been done is much more important than the fiscal outlays. Chinese industrial policy, as industrial policy in other domains, has been experimental, it has been collaborative, it has been iterative. That is, that there's been, sort of a lot of different things have been tried. There's been a huge variety of instruments from, not just fiscal incentives, but directed credit, public investment in R&D and infrastructure, government procurement, demonstration programs, regulatory changes, industry consolidation, and a very important sort of mutually supportive and occasionally competing roles between the national, provincial, and municipal governments, where the local governments, the city governments in particular, and their interactions with local governments, local businesses, have played an extremely important role, but with the center essentially watching these and occasionally consolidating, occasionally sort of expanding these practices based on the knowledge that was being accumulated in implementation in different demonstration zones and different municipalities and so forth. So it's a complicated picture. Many of you will know this better than I do, but the first real point is really that industrial policy is really not just about subsidies per se. It's about the whole institutional framework and taking an experimental, iterative approach where you're sort of constantly revising as time goes on. Now, I don't need to go through the standard arguments for why industrial policies are important. There are essentially three arguments, generic arguments for industrial policy that apply to a variety of domains. One, of course, is about externalities, technological and other externalities and spillovers. These have been very significant in the area of renewables, and they've been demonstrated for solar. The second is coordination failures, that simultaneous investments in complementary activities or upstreams or downstream to get new industries started. Nobody's going to invest in producing EVs if there isn't a battery charging network in the first place. Nobody's going to invest in the battery charging network if nobody's producing EVs and buying them and so forth. So all these new industries have a lot of complementarities, and providing that coordination is a second important function for industrial policy. And third, the need to provide activity-specific or technology-specific public inputs, which is often also the role of the government. This might be investments in particular infrastructure, specialized workforce skills, sector-specific legal and administrative frameworks. We think of these public inputs often as part of the horizontal function of government and therefore not of industrial policy. But of course, in the real world, these highly specialized technologies have very specific concrete needs that can be met only by design or particular investments that are actually very sector specific and therefore require choices to be made and therefore are part of industrial policy. Now, these are generic arguments for industrial policies. I think it's important to emphasize that the rationales for green industrial policy go beyond that. And most importantly, I think it's important to understand that there is a very important second best rationale for green industrial policy in a world where carbon emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, are underpriced. So even in the European ETS, it's not quite clear where we're getting a carbon price that approximates the true social price of carbon. Therefore, we are universally in a situation where carbon is underpriced, carbon emissions are underpriced. And that means that the return on new technologies that economize on carbon and fossil fuels is depressed relative to the social return. And therefore, green industrial policies, subsidies that actually encourage investments in renewables and in non-carbon emitting technologies and production processes are a second best way of approaching that, of dealing with the provision of these new technologies in a world where carbon is not appropriately priced. What that means is that sort of many of our worries about subsidies for green industries, for example, that there might be a competition for subsidies, or there would be a war for green industries, subsidy war for green industries, largely seem to be misplaced, because in a world where carbon is underpriced, a subsidy war for green industries is exactly what the climate doctor has ordered. So we should welcome a subsidy war for green industries rather than fret about it. So these are all sort of broadly sort of arguments for why this movement towards industrial policies has been appropriate. Now, there's when we sort of step back, there's an interesting paradox in what is happening in the fight against climate change today. Because, of course, fighting climate change is the paradigmatic case of global public goods, which requires global cooperation, coordination, because, of course, carbon emissions and their effects on global warming don't respect national borders. Yet, when we look at the successes that we've achieved, that I started out with, very little of these technological breakthroughs, very little of our success really has come through global cooperation. It's been all a hodgepodge of unilateral, uncoordinated, independent set of national actions. This obviously is true for green industrial policies. I mentioned China. Now, of course, the US is engaged in very similar policies with the IRA. The EU is about to jump on the bandwagon and so forth. But it's also true for various carbon pricing schemes that have been applied at the local level, such as in California or British Columbia, or sort of at the regional level at the EU, or many other sort of nascent carbon pricing schemes that exist in developing countries. So it's funny because these are all, by the economic logic, these unilateral measures, whether it's green industrial policy or carbon pricing schemes, really should not exist, because the very logic is it doesn't matter where the carbon is emitted. And I think part of the reason why these measures have in fact spread is that they often are motivated. These policies are motivated by a set of objectives that go beyond climate objectives. So just like Mansur Olson's work from a very long time ago, the way to provide public goods is to encourage individual actors to combine it with a set of private interests, with a private benefits. And that's, I think, exactly what has happened. And I think green industrial policies are the paradigmatic example of that countries have fixed other goals, such as competitiveness in the case of China, commercial motives, or in the case of the United States, geopolitical advantage, or jobs, or innovation, or diplomatic advantage on the global stage. A variety of other sort of narrower national objectives which are attached to these goals that go beyond fighting climate change. Now, we can look at these national goals as being a kind of a hindrance, and I'll say in a second, they create problems elsewhere in the system. But it's important to understand that these private goals or these national goals that make these climate transition policies politically feasible in the first place. So we have to accept those. So I think the sort of the last set of issues, or maybe next to last, that I want to sort of talk about is to understand that green industrial policies have very specific political advantages that go beyond the economic rationale in terms of thinking of externalities, coordination failures, spillovers, and so forth. That unlike carbon pricing, which is essentially a tax, green industrial policies are, a subsidy or a benefit to private actors. So green industrial policies create immediate winners instead of losers. And politically, it's always easier to move forward by creating winners and supporters rather than hurting people and taxing them or stepping on important interests' toes. Now that's understood, and I think that's the one immediate logic of green industrial policies, to bring, sort of to create immediate benefits. But what I think is potentially even more interesting is that this strategy of sort of green industrial policies can also lead the way to more comprehensive carbon pricing strategies. It can do so by essentially, changing the underlying political economy or the constellation of interests on the two sides of the climate transition issue, and ultimately weakening fossil fuel interests. Because these green industrial policies demonstrate early wins, they create new allies on the green side, and as green industries become more powerful, they can become a counterweight to fossil fuel interests, reducing the political opposition to phasing out carbon or carbon pricing schemes. So now in the US, for example, spending on political lobbying by green firms is about half what fossil fuel interests spend. So they're not, in terms of measured by sort of, spending on political lobbying, they're not as powerful. But essentially, in the last 2 decades, this has come up from nothing at all. So you have now a veritable green industry lobby that you did not have before. And one sort of logic of the IRA is that precisely to change the political balance in favor of these interests. There's a more subtle way in which green industrial policies also help move us towards more frontal attacks on fossil fuels, which is that new abatement policies that are incentivized by green industrial policies can also reduce the opposition to phasing out carbon. So in other words, carrots make it easier to deploy the sticks down the line because they reduce the technological cost of abatement or carbon capture and sequestration and so forth. And that's made it easier for the US to, for example, put in regulations on phasing out coal-powered fuel plants in the future. So, but when you look at sort of the role that these industrial policies are playing out and the political logic behind them, it's not then therefore surprising to find out that often these initiatives are designed in ways that may externalize some of their incidental costs. The IRA, for example, have these features of local content, sort of the EU emission trading system as the CBAM. But I think, so these are not surprising given the political logic behind these independent, autonomous measures, since they pursue domestic objectives beyond climate and must bring key interests along, that I think these independent efforts are best chance at winning the war against climate change. So I think we must overall tolerate them rather than try to discipline them, because sort of this is a politically realistic path to getting real political change, policy change in this domain, even though it looks very different from sort of what economists or technocrats optimal sort of policies based on global cooperation, global carbon pricing, and so forth would require. My last point is that so far I've presented a rather rosy or pessimistic view, which is that at least there is a path towards significant action and success. My biggest worry is that we are on a path that's going to leave developing countries essentially out in the cold, because even though developing countries can benefit from similar types of industrial policies, and many indeed are engaging in these with some success. These policies range from Indonesia's bans on unprocessed nickel ore to attract significant Chinese investments in EV supply chains and batteries, green hydrogen in Chile, production linked incentives for solar PVs in India, and so forth. So these very similar kinds of industrial policies have proliferated all around the world, and there's no reason that they cannot be equally successful. But the fundamental issue is for developing countries are the costs of overall mitigation and adaptation. And these are huge costs, and they do require significant financial and technological resources, which they do not have. And I think even though I've downplayed the importance of global cooperation with regard to green transition policies in the advanced world, I think this is indeed an area where global cooperation remains a priority in terms of providing financial and technological resources to developing countries. So, I mean, advanced countries have learned from their own experience that progress is feasible only if they transform sticks into carrots to bring potential losers along. So they have to extend the same logic to their relationship with the developing countries to understand that developing countries also will only come along on this in terms of joining on mitigation, because after all, developing countries, excluding China, will be the bulk of carbon emissions very soon, and that therefore it's in the self-interest of the advanced countries to extend this logic of the only way we can make progress on this is to turn what on the face of it is like a huge cost, like a huge stick, into something that looks more like a carrot. And in the developing countries, that's really going to require significant resource transfer there. To think, it would be remiss if we didn't, sort of remember that in a context where the overall strategy in the advanced economies has taken a very different form than what we thought it should or it might, a decade or so ago. So with that, let me stop.
That was a wonderful tour de force across all the different aspects of green industrial policy. And it's a fascinating idea that for global externality, perhaps you don't need global coordination after all, rather like Herbert Simon said, watchmakers. Sometimes when you face uncertainty, having it in fragmented parts is better than having the whole thing, trying to coordinate the whole thing all at once. Can I just start off by asking you a question? You start off at the beginning talking about wanting to have an experimental or iterative approach to different technologies to see what might work, what doesn't work, and so on. Now, apart from this being sort of plausible in place like China. In other countries, you know, it's a very attractive idea. You can see how political economy can also get in the way. Just starting something up and then closing it down is quite hard work. You know, speaking in the UK here, things take a life of their own once you start them up. So are there examples of success of this, what we really need, this sort of experimental and iterative approach? Are there cases where we can look at that we can perhaps learn some lessons from?
Yes, there are examples. I think the best example is probably the whole, DARPA-ARPA method of promoting technological innovation, which is explicitly built on the idea that you're promoting or you're trying to incentivize sort of new technologies in a whole variety of areas, but not all of them will work out. So and that's internalized in the logic of the system. So nobody really expects that everything in which DARPA gets involved will be a tremendous success. Similarly, in the U.S., the Department of Energy has had long-standing sort of loan guarantee programs, which in principle is operated on the same principle that not necessarily all of the investments that are promoted will be successful. Of course, in other countries, we have the example of, in Chile, the well-known example of the quasi-governmental outfit that operated kind of like the name now escapes me, but it's a kind of like a quasi-public venture fund, which was responsible for the salmon success in China, and the stories about 3 or 4 of their investments paid for all of their successes. So this notion that many of these programs can operate as a sort of the public equivalent of a venture capital model, has been in operation, and there have been examples of success. But I think you're right that for this to work, I think the political principles have to be explicitly market these programs in such terms. And what goes wrong is when the principles market these programs as if all of these investments will necessarily always work out, and that they've designed the perfect system from the get-go. I think the worst example, or the best example that illustrates how things can go wrong, was the Solyndra case in the United States, which was one of these in the Obama administration, one of these investments that was promoted under the Department of Energy Loan Guarantee Program. And the mistake that was done here is that it was actually Solyndra was showcased ex ante as a kind of big success before anybody actually understood whether it was going to work out or not, with President Obama visiting the factory and sort of. And of course, that sets you up as a failure if, as it happens, this one particular venture ends up being the failure. Now, nobody noticed at the time, or now it's become more commonplace that people sort of mention it, but that this, Tesla at the time received very similar loan guarantee from the Department of Energy, and of course, they become a huge success and pay their loans back earlier and so forth. And so, if the understanding of this and the way that this was politically communicated and marketed was that, look, so these are all experimental technologies. Some of them will work, some of them will not. This is very logical what we're doing. Look, maybe Solyndra fails, but look at what happened at Tesla. And then, of course, the second aspect of this, which people like Mariana Mazzucato have pointed out to, which is, wouldn't it be nice if the government could claw back some of the gains from Tesla's success, because Tesla became the huge behemoth it is now, but the public never got anything out of it, even though it essentially bailed it out at the time.
Wonderful. Let me ask if there's any. Oh, yes, there's. Could you say where you're from? And hopefully, Dani, you'll be able to hear the question. If not, I'll relay it back to you. It was once.
Thank you very much. Hopefully work. My name's Andrew Pendleton. I work for a variety of UK policy think tanks. The UK is just about to embark on an industrial strategy. It's nascent really in the UK, despite some success stories like offshore wind. And I just wonder, Dani, whether you think that's, we're sort of capable of replicating the kind of supply side interventions that the IRA has attempted to do, And particularly, one of the aims will be to solve our sort of productivity malaise in the UK. So do you think that's viable, and what advice would you give to our government?
Did you catch that, Danny?
Yeah, I did. It's a very broad question. I mean, I think, again, the question is not whether, this needs to be done. It needs to be done. I don't think it'll take the form of the IRA. I mean, when you look at the IRA, is incredibly costly. And it's not a model that I would necessarily recommend for other countries. And that's sort of at the outset, I emphasize that, let's not think about industrial strategy or industrial policy as just subsidy. Let's get away from thinking about it, because then immediately you get into this debate about fiscal costs and, can we afford it, and so forth. And that's really not a very, useful debate. I think with regard to a successful strategy in a case like Britain, first, I think we need to keep our eye on the ball. I think we have to be very clear-sighted about the objectives. The set of policies that are going to be targeted, the set of industrial policies that are going to be targeted on the green transition are not the same as the set of policies that will need to be created to deal with the problems of lagging regions, or to solve the problems of regional convergence. Now, that second problem, regional convergence or lagging regions, is not purely a social or an equity issue. It's also an aggregate productivity issue, which is why I think it's part of the domain of industrial policy. I think the issue is to create good productive jobs and bring up the overall productivity of people in the regions that have not, or in the cities that have not been doing very well. But that is going to require very different policies of working with the municipalities, establishing policy frameworks for collaboration with business and other investors. And many of the sort of the infrastructure of all of this exists, but it's a question of giving it a bigger push. So I think the answer to your question is yes, it can be done. It'll take a very different form than what it is in the United States, and let's keep eyes on the objectives, and not sort of fool ourselves that we can kill multiple birds with one stone, that we're just going to launch some big national program and we can have simultaneously solve the problems of the good jobs, the lagging regions, the middle class, as well as the green transition and resilience and supply chains and so forth.
Great. Thank you very much indeed. We have another question, gentleman in front. Please put your hand up. We probably have time for one more.
Okay, thanks so much, Professor. Just a quick question. The IEA predicts that global oil demand is going to peak by the end of the decade. I mean, that's great for the world in terms of decarbonization. It's nowhere near fast enough, but that is likely to also have implications for a lot of oil, coal, and gas-dependent communities, and also developing nations who are dependent on this. How do you see the role of industrial policy as a strategy to be able to diversify those risks and ensure a just transition in these communities, which are very heavily dependent on these resources for their own development and well-being?
Yeah, so I mean, I've talked briefly in my remarks about sort of this proliferating industrial policy, green industrial policies in developing countries as well. So that's part of the strategy of creating new areas of competence and economic opportunity in the green segment of manufacturing. But I think the bigger answer, or the bigger part of the answer to your question, is really that the job losses and dislocations that these shocks are going to create, they can only be absorbed through creating of good jobs in services. So I think just as an accounting matter, it's in a practical reality that economic diversification in the sense of promoting manufacturers or even green industries is not going to be the solution to this problem of economic restructuring, and how do we help countries or regions that are fossil fuel dependent. So that is really requiring, a different kind of industrial policy, about which I've written in a number of different places, which I've called industrial policy for services. Whether we like it or not, the bulk of future jobs are going to be created in mostly non-traded services that range from, long-term care, health, retail, a variety of personal services, and so forth. This is where the jobs of the future are. And these are the kinds of occupations in which the people who are displaced from traditional occupations in energy-dependent areas will be absorbed. That is the reality. So the only way we can help these people is by engaging in industrial policies, which now industrial is a bit of a misnomer. Let's call it productive development policies that enhance productivity in these labor-absorbing services. And again, these are not largely subsidies. They are really much more collaborative strategies of providing public services, whether it's business extension services, whether it is credit, whether it is appropriate regulatory environments, whether it is assistance with technology or marketing or entrepreneurship, to provide what these services, often small and medium-sized enterprises, need to upgrade their productivity in ways that also are allowing them to create better and more productive jobs.
Wonderful. Thank you very much indeed. And I think we better let you get away. You've been very generous with your time. Thank you very much indeed for sharing all of your thoughts, and it's great to see you again personally.
Thank you. It was very good to be with you, and I hope you have good sort of sessions in the rest of the day.
Thank you, Dani. The second half of the conference, I'm going to pass over to my colleague, William Hines, who is a colleague here at the IGCL, also works at the World Bank, and okay, even in Paris. So William, over to you.
Thanks, Angus. And I think Dani did a great job of setting out the agenda. And in this panel, there are really four themes that we wanted to really think about. The first was the economic, technological, geopolitical, and environmental context for green growth and for green industrial policies. And we're really entering this period of mid-transition where the fossil fuel economy coexists with the emerging renewables economy. And that's creating lots of instability and uncertainties. We will talk about the key concepts, theory and historical experience. And again, Dani really laid out a lot on that issue, that it's not just subsidies, but the whole institutional framework, that it needs to be experimental, collaborative, and iterative. And it's really a broader set of productive development strategies than just industrial. The third issue is analytical frameworks and data for assessing structural change, to provide us with the tools to really guide decision makers at global and national level. And the fourth are the practical considerations, the political economy at national and global level, state capacity issues that we need to think about for implementation. And again, there were lots of examples from Chile, India, China, the US, and maybe the UK on those issues. So to help us answer some of these questions, we have a great panel. And we're going to start with Isabel Estevez, who's the co-executive director of industrial policy think tank I3T, senior advisor at the Global Fund for a New Economy, and a former deputy director of industrial policy and trade at the Roosevelt Institute. And she's been advising many governments and institutions on these issues. And so, Isabel, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, William. Thanks so much for the invitation. And I also want to say that I really appreciate the prompts coming into this discussion, not just all the different themes, but really centering the why and the how of industrial policy are central questions, because they're ones that I've been really digging deep on in the past few years, coming out of a lot of work that I did on the IRA and previous work that I did on industrial policy in developing country contexts. So what I want to do in these few minutes is offer some brief answers to those key questions of the why and the how. And I very much agree with Dani to start off that the most important question in industrial policy is not whether to do it, but how to do it. But I also think that as we develop these very emerging new green industrial strategies, it's also worth kind of taking a step back and thinking about the why. So what is the point of industrial strategy? What is the point of green industrial strategy? What does a good green industrial strategy look like, and what's the measure of success? And that really gets at a fundamental question of what we mean by green and industrial and strategy, and what's a normative concept that we're working with. So I want to unpack that first. And the second question that I'll dig into is how countries can achieve those outcomes. What are the key tools that can be used? The industrial policy toolkit, like Dani said, is incredibly broad. It includes everything from public investment to procurement, performance standards, intellectual property rights. And I think that any policy tool can really be used as an industrial policy tool if its purpose is to change production systems. So there are a lot of rich lessons from concrete historical experience that can help us think about what tools are best in which very specific contexts. But to begin with the first question, why do we even care about green industrial strategy? What is the goal and what's the measure of success? I think at a very general level, green industrial strategy is just a strategy that tries to change production and provisioning systems with some kind of environmental objective at a very abstract level. And more specifically, I want to distinguish a bit between what green industrial policies are looking like in practice and what they could or should be looking like from a normative standpoint. So many of us in this space have made the point that today's green industrial strategies are actually a bit narrow at the moment. First, they're a little bit narrow in terms of the industries and the technologies they're targeting. Most are geared at ramping up production of renewable energy products or renewable energy infrastructure and inputs and value chains. And they're very centered on the energy sector and on energy-intensive sectors like transportation and heavy industry. But they haven't really tackled sectors like food and agriculture that also face massive environmental challenges around the land use and emissions and pollution, or the services sector where there's a huge opportunity to expand environmentally friendly productive activities. So that's the first way in which they've been a bit narrow, just in terms of industries and the scope of the productive sector they cover. Second, I think they're also been a bit narrow in terms of the range of environmental parameters they're trying to solve for. So as we've said, they're focused on reducing greenhouse gas emissions, which is extremely important. But these policies haven't really engaged with other pressing environmental challenges like biodiversity loss or water and land pollution or even toxic air pollution. So we have all of these policies that are aimed at developing new industries and transforming existing industries, but only to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, not to deal with the broader environmental impacts of industrial systems, which is a problem concretely because it risks creating new technological path dependencies that may solve for greenhouse gas emissions reductions, but don't really solve for broader environmental challenges or maybe even make some of them worse, including things like biodiversity loss, which many people have noted is just as pressing a challenge as climate change. So that's the second narrowness that I think we need to work on, the range of environmental parameters that are incorporated into industrial strategy. And the third way in which today's green industrial strategies are a bit narrow is in terms of how they factor in, or rather how they don't really factor in, a lot of those systemic relationships and interactions that Dani was alluding to early, and interactions between green objectives and broader non-green objectives. So many of us have made the point that green industrial policies, if they are to have developmental outcomes, need to be designed in a way that really does try to multi-solve, so to address several missions at once in an efficient way. So they need to be designed in a way that doesn't just make industries greener, but also improves equity, also creates quality jobs, also bolsters macroeconomic resilience. And if they're not designed with that range of broader objectives in mind, then they can end up undermining even the core objective of green transformation. For example, by weakening the political alliances that support green industrial policies, which can happen very easily if economic benefits of those policies are not realized and are not felt. And you're seeing that a little bit right now in the US, where some unions held out for a very long time or even abstained from endorsing first Biden and then Harris in the current election because they felt like labor standards were not being adequately incorporated into the administration's new green industrial strategies. To also give a kind of a different example in a different context of these systemic challenges, last week, Bloomberg's Odd Lots podcast had a very interesting interview with Isabella Weber, where she talked about how the carbon pricing system for carbon-intensive industries in the EU is creating certain competitive disadvantages in the EU vis-a-vis the US, which has a more public investment-led green industrial strategy. And she talked about how the increase in carbon prices also carries inflationary risks or risks of carbonflation, which may then lead to increasing interest rates to control inflation, which in turn makes it more difficult to invest in greening industries, which have very high upfront costs and high capex costs. So those systemic risks all need to be very carefully managed. And like Dani said, they require a lot of experimentation and adjustment. So all of these critiques about the various kinds of narrow qualities of today's emerging industrial strategies, I think very naturally lead to a more holistic normative understanding of green industrial strategy. And what I'm proposing in a forthcoming paper is that we can think about good industrial policy as being about transforming production and provisioning systems to fulfill human needs more fully and more equitably, and to do so within ecosystem boundaries, also taking into account the systemic relationships between green measures and broader social economic dynamics and objectives. So for all industrial policy, green and non-green industrial policy, that's the challenge. How do we change the way that we produce and we provide useful things more equitably in a way that's consistent with the long-term livability of the planet and broader societal missions? And of course, that certainly entails producing more solar panels, producing more wind turbines, making cleaner steel, making cleaner aluminum, but it also entails a lot more than that. It also entails making sure that the supply chains for those products are also minimizing environmental impact, that they're upholding good labor standards. It also entails demand reduction for some things. So industrial policy is about what we produce more of, but it's also about what we produce less of. And it entails thinking about how industrial policy can be designed to create good jobs, to create new linkages, to manage inflation, to ensure food security, to reduce poverty. How do we think about all of those things holistically and systemically? And I think the good news here is that those things are challenging, but it's actually not that difficult to do all those things at once with a little bit of creativity. As we've said, there's a huge range of tools that are available for green industrial strategy. I have a paper that I published last year with the Roosevelt Institute on multi-solving trade-offs and conditionalities for industrial strategy that address some of those tools and how to try to multi-solve in an efficient way. And also what you see when you look at real world concrete examples, there's a lot of creativity and a lot of subtlety to the way that you can deploy each of those individual instruments. So I want to give just one very concrete example of how one of those tools, specifically procurement policies, has been used in one developing country, which I'll do in a second. But also for context, for those of you that may be new to the industrial policy field, I'll just say that government procurement or government purchases are one of the most widely used industrial policies all around the world, not least because government procurement makes up about 10% or more of GDP around the world. And one of the best known examples of procurement policy being used as industrial policy is the US Buy American policy, which establishes minimum levels of domestic content for certain kinds of government purchases for things like concrete, steel, for infrastructure policies, infrastructure projects. But these kinds of procurement policies are actually very widely used around the world to stimulate production of certain products. And the US, by the way, is also experimenting with buy clean policies, so using procurement for to stimulate the production of low carbon steel, concrete, et cetera, for certain sectors. But like I said before, I really want to zoom in on an example from a developing country. So I'm going to talk about how Ecuador used procurement policy about a decade ago, experimenting with the use of government procurement for an array of objectives. And Ecuador is exactly one of those commodity-dependent countries that needs diversification. About 50% of its exports are oil, and bananas, flowers, and shrimp make up much of the rest. So it's a typical case of a productive structure that needs to be diversified to develop more high value added productive sectors, to capture more value, and to build economic resilience in the face of commodity shocks. So taking a cue and adapting the kinds of procurement policies that the US and Europe use, what Ecuador decided to do was to create a system of procurement policies that did a few things at once. First, it gave slight preferences across product categories to suppliers, both foreign and domestic suppliers, that were willing to incorporate certain levels of domestic content in their products and services. Then it gave higher preferences in some strategic sectors to suppliers that were willing to do some level of technology transfer. So everything from training workers to do maintenance on sophisticated capital goods, to investing in local companies to develop new productive capabilities. So you had this combination of sort of wide and shallow preferences and narrow and deep preferences for specific sectors, both to generate demand pull for new industries. And on top of that, they also had a layer where they gave preferences to certain sectors from small and micro enterprises or associative enterprises to diversify the base of suppliers and to decrease market concentration in the procurement market. And they also implemented something like an early version of a buy clean policy, where they required all government vehicles to be electric vehicles. And they gave preferences to suppliers that had environmental impact certificates, more generally beyond the automotive sector. And the thesis here was that, yes, you definitely want to stimulate the services sector, but you also need a manufacturing sector because manufacturing is a source of innovation, it's a source of productivity growth. And I do want to say that even though I very much agree that the services sector is growing and very important, there's a reason that Germany and the US want to keep their manufacturing sector. So there's a reason that it's still featured in the industrial strategies of developing countries as well. And well, this set of procurement policies that Ecuador implemented did have some pretty interesting results in just a couple of years. So first, there was a displacement of imports in favor of new domestic production. So some moves toward development of new industries and all of that significant enough to have a macroeconomic impact of more than 1% of GDP as a result of the reduction of imports, just with this one policy instrument. And it also made the procurement market much less concentrated and much more competitive. So before the policy, there were only 32 suppliers that accounted for 50% of government purchases. And within 2 years of implementation, no single supplier held more than 1.3% of the procurement market. So it brought in a host of new economic actors, especially smaller ones that had been excluded before, and had been sidelined by more oligopolistic dynamics. And finally, it obviously reduced the demand for combustion vehicles quite directly and increased the demand for electric vehicles. So that's an example of just how one single policy tool in one country over the course of 2 years was used to tackle multiple economic, social, and environmental problems at once. And I think it's a sort of useful illustrative reference point to think about how to design not just good industrial policy, but good green industrial policy. And really the main takeaway that I want to convey here is that any industrial policy, and every country does industrial policy, whether or not they call it that, but every industrial policy is also an environmental policy. It's also a distributional policy. It's also a natural resources policy and a labor policy and a macroeconomic policy. So these things are interconnected. And as we try to reshape production systems to make them greener, we also have to think about how to green production in a way that's coherent and intertwined with broader development objectives. And I'll leave it there for now. Thank you.
Thanks, Isabel. That was a really great presentation. And I think we take your call to think systemically about these issues and think about industrial policy to really multi-solve these other issues: equity, quality jobs, macro stability, inflation, etc. So thanks. And the procurement example from Ecuador was really insightful. Thanks so much. Our next speaker is Simon Sharp, who is the Director of Economics for the Climate Champions team at the UNFCCCC, and a Senior Fellow at the World Resources Institute. He's also leading the Innovation Hub for C3A. So, Simon.
Thanks, William. I'm just getting mic'd up. I was very happy to hear earlier on that the UK government's working on an industrial strategy. That's good news. I was part of the government team that wrote the last one. And what was that, about 5 years ago, 6 years ago? While we were doing it, I remember at one point, one of the MPs stood up in Parliament and said, do you know how often we've had a new industrial strategy over the past 50 years? And he'd actually worked this out. And he said, on average, it was once every 3 years. So either that means we're really good at experimental and iterative things like Dani was talking about in China, or it just means we can't stick at anything. But my experience of working on industrial strategy in government was that I say we collectively, didn't know if we should have one, didn't know what one was for and why, certainly didn't know how to do one. People had ideas, but all of those things were contested. So industrial strategy faces very existential questions. I think it still does, and I think it's useful to have more clarity about those as we try and deal with what we're calling today green industrial strategy, since the future of human civilization probably depends on it. So, okay, there's a funky clicker thing, but that doesn't work. I'll just use the keyboard. That doesn't either. There we go. There we go. So I'm just going to assume everybody's. I'm not going to talk too long about any of these because we've already heard a lot of good thoughts. But first of all, what kind of economy are we dealing with? This actually influences everything else, every other question that we ask ourselves afterwards. Do we think we're dealing with an economy that is like a machine? It's in equilibrium. It might have some moving parts, but the relationships between them never change, and there are never any new parts that come into this. So it has a limited range of future states, and it can either function or fail. And if it functions really well, it can be optimized. Do we think the economy is like that, or do we think it's like an ecosystem where its components and its structure are constantly evolving? It's in disequilibrium, it's uncertain, it has an unknowable and effectively unlimited range of future states, and it neither functions nor fails, and there's no such thing as optimality. I would say that generally it's the latter. The economy is like an ecosystem. But if you think it's like a machine, if you think it's in equilibrium, then you have to ask yourself, over what time and spatial scales is that an appropriate assumption to make? When is that a good first approximation, and when is it not? And if your concern is what the IPCC calls rapid and far-reaching system transitions in the global economy, unprecedented in terms of scale, then by definition, you're talking about time and space scales over which the economy is definitely not in equilibrium. So you need to be thinking about it in this ecosystem way. Things would be good if we were. It would be slightly easier for ourselves. Still not easy, but a bit easier. So I'll explain why. The next question that follows is, how should we think about transition strategy? Well, if you think the economy is fixed and nothing in it ever changes, then it's like this left-hand side. Your starting point is there's a market failure. People are leaving the rubbish out, nobody's taking it away. What do? Well, you need to make the polluter pay. That your aim is returning to an optimal state. What is that optimal state? Well, it's defined in terms of allocative efficiency. It's the best possible sharing out of the resources that you currently have. That state of allocative efficiency, that perfect optimal state, it only exists in the static machine-like economy. If we're in an evolving disequilibrium, uncertain economy, there is no perfect allocation of resources. And if there is no optimality, your aim cannot be to return to that optimality. So all of the rest of the chain of logic falls apart, including the conclusion that the best policy is to make the polluter pay, price the externality. All of that logic just falls away. And you're left with more of a clean sheet, not entirely a clean sheet, but you're left with no strong presumptions over which policy is likely to be the best. Why do you have not entirely a clean sheet? Well, the end of that IPCC statement is unprecedented in terms of scale, but not necessarily in terms of speed. Why do they say that? Because we've had technology transitions in the past, and some of them were fast. You can look back at those, you can see what made them happen at all, what made them happen more quickly than they might have done otherwise. And each one's unique, but you can spot some patterns. And this diagram's from Frank Heels, who's probably spent more time than anybody looking back at those past examples and spotting the patterns. This is what a transition looks like. It's messy. Change starts small in a niche. It breaks through, it eventually disrupts the mainstream, and eventually the disruptive thing becomes the new dominant pattern. It's not about allocative efficiency, it's about dynamic efficiency. How do you change structure and change it effectively so that small amounts of effort go a long way? So what kinds of policy do we need, and how does it change how we think about particular policies? Well, the most important thing, if you're trying to start small and end large, is you need some reinforcing feedbacks on your side, self-amplifying processes. Luckily, we have some. In many technologies, including the clean technologies, you get really strong self-amplifying, reinforcing feedbacks. When you deploy a new technology, it gets better, it gets cheaper. Other technologies emerge that make it more useful. More people want it, more people invest in it, more of it gets deployed, it gets cheaper and better, and so on. It's because of those kind of feedbacks that the world deployed more than 10 times as much solar power in 2020 as it expected to achieve at that date, roughly 15 years earlier. China, by the way, deployed about 140 times as much as it had expected to 12 years earlier. So these things are incredibly powerful. If you want good policy for the transition, focus on how do you strengthen these reinforcing feedbacks. Seen from that way, targeted investment in the new technology is not a second best. In fact, it's the best thing. It's the most efficient thing. It directly strengthens the reinforcing feedbacks of the new technology. Early in the transition, what happens if you tax the incumbent technology? Well, nothing very much. Maybe you nudge it to be slightly more efficient. That's about all. It's not an efficient policy at all at that stage in the transition. It might become more useful later on. Regulations, if you think that they're introduced in a way that disrupts your perfect allocative efficiency situation that you had, you'll expect them to add costs. And this is why in the UK government, we have guidance about minimizing the regulatory burden. And somebody reminded me recently that the Cameron government had this wonderful one in, one out policy. Create one new regulation and you have to scrap an old one. And apparently that even evolved into one in, two out, which is kind of shocking. I always like to remind people when you drive on the road, remember that it's a regulation that tells you to drive on the left-hand side. And if you didn't have that regulation, it wouldn't be more efficient. Regulations actually, as this little graph here by Stephen Chu, who was Energy Secretary to Barack Obama, showed, if you do them the right way, they can accelerate innovation and accelerate cost reduction. The reason is the economy is this evolving ecosystem. When you regulate, you change the fitness function of the economy. Well, sometimes you can do that really badly. Other times you can do it in a way that says, you old inefficient fridges, you're no longer going to be successful in the economy. You have to innovate. You can't just keep advertising your dirty products. When we think about tax, again, I don't want to dwell on this, but we think about it differently from this disequilibrium point of view. It's not about perfect balance, it's about points of leverage. So it's not about internalizing the externality. You don't need to work out the damage done to the economy by a ton of carbon emissions. That's irrelevant to how quickly you can change the structure of the economy and how effectively you can do so. So tax and, in fact, subsidy and regulations should target tipping points. Make one thing cheaper, more profitable, more accessible, more attractive than another. Of course, what follows from that is you don't want the same carbon price in all sectors of the economy. That's designed to maximize allocative efficiency. It does nothing for dynamic efficiency. It will be wastefully high in some sectors and uselessly low in others. So you need a carbon price to be different in each sector. And if you really want to do carbon pricing and you think it's your main policy, well, think very hard about which kind you want, because tax and an emissions trading scheme are not fundamentally equivalent. Even if they have the same average price over the period concerned, they have different dynamics. An ETS has a balancing feedback, it's inherently self-limiting, it's probably the slowest and least cost-effective way to tackle climate change. So I've come to what we might call industrial strategies sort of halfway through this, because I think transition strategy and industrial strategy are not quite the same thing. They're very similar, but what I've just been talking about is a strategy for technology transition. In this case, one that helps us eliminate greenhouse gas emissions from the economy. Now, to me, industrial strategy means something a bit more than that. It means you also want to be good at making and selling some product or service to the rest of the world. Now, they overlap a lot, but not 100%. Maybe in this country, we want to be good at offshore wind. and sell that to the rest of the world. Do we also want to be good at heat pumps? Well, probably not. We need to deploy loads and loads of them, but we've been really slow in getting started on this. We'll probably never be the best at heat pumps. Who cares? Let's just import cheap ones from China or wherever makes them, get them deployed. It doesn't matter. We can't be good at everything. So I think there's not 100% overlap. But of course, if the biggest deliberate structural change in the global economy that humanity has ever attempted is happening, and hey, that's foreseeable. We've got some idea of the direction we're going in. Why not try and be good at some of it? We might as well. So when we were working on this 5 years ago and we're grappling with this question of why do you have industrial strategy, we had a lot of responses like this on the left, that the orthodox view is the only sensible strategy is no strategy. Well, if you think the economy is perfect just how it is, then that's the rule. Of course, there aren't many areas of life where that would be the right rule to follow. Secondly, government should help in sectors with comparative advantage. Well, that sounds good. Do what you're good at. The problem is comparative advantage is calculated based on what you used to be good at. And if the world's changing, maybe what you used to be good at isn't what the world wants in 5 years' time or 10 years' time. And then the more enlightened view, government should help specific sectors if that addresses some kind of market failure. But that goes right back to where I started. It assumes that there has to be a market failure, which assumes that there has to be a perfect market, which assumes that everything is static. So actually, that's just the wrong paradigm. It's not really helping you. And this was Theresa May's industrial strategy and her conclusion that a truly strategic government must do more than just fix the foundations. It must also plan for a rapidly changing future. In other words, try to be good at what the world needs, not just what you were good at and worked well for you in the past. So finally, William asked me to say something about analytical tools. So let's say we want to do a rapid low carbon transition, and we also want to be good at making and selling some of those clean technologies. But the principles I talked about earlier in terms of policies certainly help. If you follow those ideas about investing in the clean technology, regulating to reallocate industry investment from the fossils to the clean, targeting the tipping points, and so on, that will definitely help. There's a strong overlap between deploying clean technologies quickly, building up markets, and incentivizing investment. But of course, it won't mean you're competitive at everything. By definition, you can't be. So what analytical tools are there to help us think about it more? Well, I'm not going to say that they're all ready and waiting and we just have to pick them up and we'll get all the right answers. In fact, really not that. I think they're only partially developed. They're not very widespread. They're not very well available. They're not very well tested. There's a long way to go. So 3 questions that governments are really thinking about. Well, first, what should we try and be good at? In which sectors or which products should we try and build competitiveness? There's this approach called economic complexity analysis, which looks at how closely related different products are to each other. Instead of being completely backward-looking, like revealed comparative advantage, it is at least slightly forward-looking, because it says, if you're good at this one thing, you might also be able to get good at this other thing. But this is really contested. There are people who champion this approach, including people at Harvard and Oxford, Eric's colleagues, and in the World Bank. And there are other people that rubbish it. And they say, no, there are far too many distorting factors. It doesn't tell you anything at all. And this debate is quite a live one. And for me, one of the limitations that is also important is this approach only looks at the set of products that we have now. It's based on past data, even though it's doing its best to be forward-looking. And of course, as Stuart Kaufman has said, the single most important defining characteristic of the economy over the past 1,000,000 years or so is it keeps producing new stuff. So how do we think about where new stuff might arise in the economy? How do we get good at making things that nobody's made yet? Second question governments ask themselves a lot is, okay, if we do want to get competitive at something, how do we do that? How do we build it up? And here I think simulating models, sector-specific models that simulate the processes of technology diffusion and investment are quite useful. But there are not many of those yet. And most of the ones that there are actually don't explicitly represent competition in global markets. So for example, you want to know something about the steel transition globally. You'd like to be competitive at making green steel at the same time as making the transition. Is there a model that helps you see how your policies will interact with those in China or America or India? Well, no, nobody's built one of those yet, which is kind of shocking because we've known for 30 years that we needed to decarbonize the global steel industry. IPCC has done reports since 1992. And finally, macroeconomic models. You might want to know what are the macroeconomic effects of your industrial strategy and your transition policies. Many governments are interested in that. And at the broadest level, whether your macroeconomic model tells you the transition will be a plus or a minus depends on the input assumptions that you make, particularly whether you think that resources in the economy are perfectly allocated to start with or whether they're not. Gives you the opposite results. There are some disequilibrium macroeconomic models which can go a bit further in exploring structural change and instability in the economy, but they don't have very high resolution in the different sectors. So one that's very well known, the E3ME model from Cambridge Econometrics, which in a way descends from Keynes himself, it doesn't distinguish between jobs in solar manufacturing and jobs in the same broader category of activities that that's part of. It doesn't distinguish between jobs making electric vehicles from jobs making petrol cars. So again, if I'm a government and I want to look at the macroeconomic effects of the transition in a model that realistically simulates the economy's disequilibrium behavior and also has enough resolution of the different sectors so that I can get some idea of what happens, where do I turn, when nobody has built that model yet. So I think there is a really important agenda of developing these analytical tools and of course, putting them to use quickly. And until we have them, what's the best we can do? Well, at least use the conceptual frameworks that are appropriate to this problem. In particular, look at how technology transitions have played out in the past and learn the lessons from that. So that's where I'll stop. Thank you. There's more information online at these two places.
Thank you, Simon. That was a really interesting presentation, and thanks for revisiting the rationale and really setting it out so clearly, and also how we could think differently about many of these traditional policy instruments. And the analytical tools discussion, I think, is one that Rebuilding Macro is really looking at very closely. And I think you're right. Some of these methods that you propose are still quite contentious, but it's an important debate. The next speaker is, it's a real pleasure to introduce Eric Beinhocker. He's the founder and executive director of the Institute for New Economic Thinking, INET, at the University of Oxford, and also a professor of public policy practice at the Blavatnik School of Government at Oxford. And I think he's a real inspiration, a key figure in the new economic thinking movement. And it's really great to have him here today. So, Eric.
Thank you, William, and thanks for having me today. I've got just a few slides that I will share. Can everyone see that? Yeah. And I think my remarks will certainly be consistent with what we've heard before, and hopefully will build on a few of the themes that have been raised. I thought I'd just start with this quote from Ronald Reagan. You know, economists are the sort of people who see something works in practice and wonder if it would work in theory. And I think that characterizes some of the recent debate around industrial policy. There's still a bit of a feeling in the economics community, but also more importantly in many finance ministries and many governments, that we've kind of landed on industrial policy as a sort of a second best, political compromise because of the difficulties in getting carbon pricing implemented and getting it to work. And I want to make the point, which our other speakers have also made, that it's actually not the second best. This is actually the right way to handle this problem, and thinking about how we do it and what makes it successful is key. So I'm going to talk briefly about just a little reframing of the problem of energy transition. I also want to go back in history a little bit to just note that this isn't new, that we've been doing industrial policy for a long time, and there's some lessons to learn from that. and evidence that it actually does work, and a few points about making it work well. So first, and this is consistent with some of the points that Simon was making, that there's basically two ways to look at the problem of the energy transition. First is that it's a problem of marginal pricing. This is it's the unpriced externality. We've got to shift the marginal prices of fossil fuels and clean energy, and therefore we need carbon pricing of either carbon taxes or carbon markets. The other way to look at this problem is that it's a problem of structural transition, that it requires, as Isabel nicely put it, a fundamental change in the structure of the energy and production system. And so this means that basically, what happens on the ground in this is we need to swap out one set of infrastructure and one set of assets for another set of infrastructure and assets. And so this means it's a systems problem that requires innovations, massive investment, new supply chains, industrial ecosystems, public good investments, new regulatory frameworks, and also changes to our institutional structures. And all of this has to happen in at least somewhat a coordinated way. And the only way you can drive such a large structural change across all these dimensions is through a portfolio of policies that we've given the label industrial policies, from, as Dani noted, R&D support, subsidies, tax incentives, public goods investments, procurement, regulation, and so on. And one thing that I think has thrown us off over the past decades is actually the left framing isn't wrong about certain kinds of environmental problems. So this actually probably was a pretty good framing for dealing with acid rain, with sulfur emissions. The pricing of that externality in a very narrow market specific application actually worked pretty well. But I think people in the environmental and economics community and regulatory community drew the wrong lessons from that same idea could be applied on an economy-wide and systems-wide perspective. And again, the clean energy transition is a very different beast. As Simon said, this is a historical transition. It's more akin to the Industrial Revolution than a narrow regulatory problem, and requires systems change, not just marginal change. The second point I'd like to make is that we've done this before, and we drove a systems change, through the 19th and early 20th centuries in the Industrial Revolution, and the current fossil fuel-based energy and production system was built by industrial policy. It was not built solely by free markets. If you just look at the U.S. history of this, there's a huge history of R&D support. The U.S. Navy funded Thomas Edison in his development of electricity and light bulbs, going right up to the Department of Energy critical support that developed fracking in the 70s and 90s. Tax incentives have been used going back to the 1920s to stimulate investment in the coal industry. And we know that fossil fuels have been tax favored for basically a century since then. Huge use of subsidies, again, going through the 1800s and 1900s, up to today, where fossil fuels get about 15 billion of direct subsidies in the U.S. and the IMF estimates about 600 billion in indirect subsidies. Tariffs have also been used since the 1800s to favor domestic energy production. Government procurement played a huge role in fossil fuels, particularly starting in World War I with massive government purchasing of coal and oil. Huge public goods investments, the Federal Highways Acts, electrification, the Tennessee Valley Authority, and so on. And then a whole set of regulatory acts that set up the regulatory frameworks that enabled this sector to grow and attract capital and reduce risk and so on. So we should note one huge piece of evidence that this can work is we did it for a century and it built the fossil fuel economy. And, I like to tell my students the current fossil fuel economy was not built by taxing candles and horses. It was built through a very active and strategic industrial policy. This was, for both the US and when Europe went through something similar, it was a very clear and specific goal of government to build this energy system, electrify the economy, and develop fossil fuel capacities. And it was also sustained over time. We don't have a century to do this, but a key point is the policies didn't just come and go. The investment flows and policy support was sustained for extended periods of time. One of the reasons why earlier attempts at industrial policy and clean energy kind of got a bit of a bad name was a lot of it was very off and on. For example, in the US, subsidies for wind and solar would come in some political administrations, then be repealed a few years later, and then re-implemented and so on. And that yo-yo effect was very negative for investors and for industry trying to develop those businesses. We also now have a growing body of evidence that, and Dani alluded to this, that and so did Isabel, that if we look now at what has actually worked in reducing emissions and in driving technology substitution, it has been clean energy policies. Carbon pricing, unfortunately, there's been a lot of work now looking retrospectively at the impact, and the evidence all says it's pretty negligible at best. The carbon pricing coverage has grown. The World Bank does this nice report on it every year, and it's roughly about a fifth of global emissions have some kind of carbon price attached to them. But if you actually dig into that data, you find that only 0.8% of global emissions are covered by a price that you could say is effective, that's greater than the social cost of capital. So that's a pretty poor payoff for literally decades of hard work and investment of political capital. And when you try to link this to actual emissions impacts, it's even more negligible. And basically, the only cases where it's even made a dent in the emissions curve is when you've had very high floor prices, like in some recent years in the UK. And you could even say that when the floor prices are that high, it's not so much the market at work, it's actually a form of regulation in effect. And we also know that the politics around carbon pricing are pretty difficult. On the other side, we have a growing body of work, and these are just some examples, and I should have put up the great work that Roosevelt has done in Isabel's group. A growing body of evidence that the clean energy industrial policies have been working, that they have been driving much of the development in solar and wind and clean energy substitution that we've seen to date. And my group at Oxford actually just recently published a paper in Science establishing the linkages between these policies and actual emissions reductions, and you can see it in the statistics. And one of the points that paper makes is that it's almost never a single policy that's actually working most effectively, but rather it's these kind of clusters of policies working together that often move the needle in terms of emissions, and how the policies interact and reinforce each other to create those kind of positive feedbacks that Simon talked about is really critical. Now, if we also step back and look at this research and say, okay, what's the secret of success in making industrial policy work? Well, we've seen there are some best practices that we should be learning and sharing from. Isabel gave some great case examples on that. There's also new analytical tools that Simon talked about that we can start to develop and deploy to be smarter about how we do this. But when I've been looking at the real-world implementation and development of these policies, again, particularly in the US, the one thing that struck me over and over is policy is people. And that if you had to ask me what's the one most important thing for governments to think about in doing industrial policy, it's HR. It's getting the right people in the right places to do this kind of policy. And that's because industrial policy is not a one-size-fits-all solution. There's no kind of magic formula to it. Instead, it's a portfolio of a whole collection of very nitty-gritty, often quite detailed technical policies and regulations. And you need the right skills and knowledge and people to be able to help design and implement those things. The devil really, really is in the details. Often the kind of high-level policy or strategy of what you're trying to do and the sectors you're working in things, that's usually pretty clear. But when you get into the details of how do the subsidies work and who gets them and how much and all that, that's where the rubber meets the road. And so here, you need these skills and knowledge all through government, from the legislative side in terms of like staff committees and committee staff and things like that. You need to be able to get expert input, but also resistance to lobbyists disguised as experts. One of the things I've seen over and over again is, lobbyists come in and end up writing half the bill. And it's not necessarily completely corrupt. It's often because, they're the ones who are bringing the technical expertise to the table that is lacking in the congressional offices or in the regulatory agencies. So we need to instead have experts in place who aren't lobbyists in disguise. And we really need to beef up civil service capabilities in the implementing agencies in this. Another US example, practically overnight, Treasury became the largest implementing agency in the world for, energy industrial policy with the IRA. Now, before the IRA, they had a few folks in Treasury you could find who knew something about climate and energy, but you could probably get them all in one small conference room. And now, that agency has been asked to implement, this hundreds of billions of dollars of subsidies and programs. And you need to also be able to have effective collaborations with the private sector also without getting captured. And so this presents a huge challenge. Again, even in the country I know best, the US as well as the UK, I wouldn't say we're there yet on having these skills and capabilities. And often they're not in the right places too. So, environmental ministries may have, down in their bowels, a lot of the right technical expertise, but if it's not being accessed in the finance ministry or in the, other agencies, it may not be that helpful. And then if we go to emerging and developing countries, the story is even more challenging. We've been hearing, a number of emerging country governments saying, well, what would an IRA for us look like? And it's a great question to ask, but it not only has the challenges of you may not have the fiscal capacity and headroom that rich developed countries have, but also this kind of technical expertise in government to get these policy rights is just a critical lever. So if I leave you with one message, it's yes, we should do industrial policy. We need to do it at scale and at speed. And the key to doing that is going to be people. Thank you.
Thanks, Eric. That was great. Thanks for making the points around the portfolio of policies and the type of change we're talking about, which is structural, systemic, and not just marginal. So let's move to questions. And we have a few questions online, one from Alan Kerman about the reaction of the public. And it seems that everyone is ignoring the fact that people like their SUVs, and green policies overlook the necessity of changing attitudes. So very little discussion of the discomfort of the transition. So perhaps the speakers could reflect on that. And then a question from Sarah Clifton at the Economic Change Unit. When most of the negative environmental externalities of current green industries in global north countries are in the global south, how do we go about addressing these externalities in the green industrial policies of global north countries? And perhaps there might be some additional questions in the room. So Angus, are there questions there?
There is indeed. There's a gentleman here with a microphone. Over to you, sir.
Thank you. My name is Martin White. I'm a director of the UK Shareholders Association. Can you hear me okay? Which relies on volunteers and prides itself on its independence from the financial sector. I want to ask a question which I don't think we've really touched on. It's about the potential role of shareholders and what motivates company managements in the business decisions of individual companies. In the UK, we know that the financial sector has a reputation for encouraging a short-term focus. This is a really deep and embedded problem, given the power of the financial sector. Do you think we should be facing up to the problem and thinking deeply about it, rather than introducing regulations into the activity?
Thank you very much. William, we have another question, a lady at the back there, please.
Yeah, thank you so much for these contributions. I think my key question is, given the timeline on which this all needs to happen and the challenge of building new capabilities and things like analytical tools and all of those people-related capabilities that you mentioned, Eric, does that make you wonder who exactly should be building those capabilities in order to deliver for emerging developing countries? Or do you think it's just a question of trying to build them within government as quickly as possible? Thanks.
Any other questions in the room? Yes, there's a gentleman at the front. Thank you.
Yeah, Adam Khan from Commonwealth. We're a think tank. I wanted to ask Simon specifically, but also others, about the Labour government's position here, and particularly GB Energy and the National Wealth Fund, obviously on the eve of the Labour Party conference, if you have views on that. And also maybe more generally the role of public ownership in industrial strategies.
Great. A final shout for any questions in the room? Any further questions? 3, 2, 1. No. William, back to you.
Okay, well, maybe we'll turn then for some final thoughts. And if you want to take up some of these questions, please do as well. Let's maybe start with Isabel.
Thanks so much, William. Yes, I'll just address a couple of things because I have to hop off. I'm late to a meeting. And on the first question about what are the most negative environmental externalities of the current green industrial policies in global north countries, and how can we go about addressing those? I think the one that really stands out is, of course, the supply chain of both electric vehicles and solar panels, et cetera, involves a lot of mining and the expansion of mining in the global south. So that's the one that most people have paid attention to. And I think there are many ways to address that, including some of those standards that I alluded to earlier, environmental and labor and social standards along the supply chain, and incorporating that into global north industrial policies. But more concretely, I think one thing that's really underexplored is the use of both, first, the expansion of recyclability, so that we don't have to mine as much. And second, just different prospecting strategies. So right now, the reason that we mine where we mine is often because that's where people happen to have found those resources. But you can have more purposeful and directed prospecting to maybe mine in places that are not going to destroy the water sources of indigenous communities. So I think they're interesting experiments, but very early conversations, and I think it merits more attention. And just one quick note on public ownership. At the Roosevelt Institute, we've done a lot of work on this and have found over and over again that public ownership tends to be quite critical in the green transition. For example, in the space of green steel, the most advanced investment that we have in the US to experiment with green steel is actually a public company, but it's not a US public company, it's a Swedish public company. And I think they're actually playing an important role and need to be much more explored as tools for the green transition. Thank you.
Thanks, Isabel. Maybe we'll go to Eric next.
Sure. Well, maybe I'll start with Alan's question about people liking their SUVs. I can't see the room, but yeah, maybe a raise of hands. How many people own an electric vehicle? And how many of you would ever sell that electric vehicle and go back to a petrol vehicle? I'm guessing no one is raising their hand. Am I right? So
0, 2 on the first question, 0 on the second.
Okay, right. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. The point being that the good news is that these technologies are actually better for consumers, and consumers like them. Customer satisfaction of, you may like your SUV, but if you have an electric SUV, you like it even better. And all the evidence says that the hard part is getting customers to make the switch or try in the first place to get over their range anxiety and try the SUV or and so on, and that's where the subsidies really help. But once you get them into the electric vehicle, it's a one-way ticket. They're in it for good. Same thing, LED light bulbs. Once people start putting those in their house, they're not pining for the days when you had to change your light bulbs all the time or pay a higher energy bill. So I actually think, it's probably been underplayed, but a lot of these industrial policies have major consumer benefits. and also efficiency and productivity gains. Michael, Bloomberg New Energy Finance has done some nice work, showing the efficiency and productivity gains from lots of these technologies and how they ripple through to lower prices across a whole variety of sectors of the economy. On the negative spillovers to emerging economies, I think that's actually been probably overplayed. I'm not saying that they don't exist and aren't an important issue, but for example, the mining issues, the mining, of critical minerals and things should be, as clean as possible and high labor standards and everything else we would want from that. But when you compare what's being added in terms of new mining activity versus what would be going away on the fossil fuel side, the scales of the two things are just vastly different. The scale of environmental impact and mining, negative externalities from critical minerals versus what we are doing today in digging up fossil fuels around the world is vastly, vastly different. So, and again, there's been some good studies showing, that there are huge environmental benefits to shutting down the fossil fuel stuff, and they are not outweighed by negative consequences in the clean energy supply chains. And likewise, there's also very positive spillovers, particularly for emerging economies. Having subsidy wars between China and the US to make energy cheaper is pretty good for a lot of emerging economies, that have energy poverty. And likewise, one also underappreciated benefit of clean energy is the certainty of energy prices. The huge fluctuations in energy prices that came out of Putin's invasion of Ukraine around the world did huge damage in emerging economies. It wreaks havoc with their current accounts and trade balances and prices for for consumers. Also, many developing countries subsidize energy because of the poverty issues, and so it's killed government fiscal balances. All that goes away, with clean energy, because once you buy a solar panel and put it in, how much it's going to, you paid for it. It's, operating cost is almost nil. So I think we need to look more closely at that issue and actually, show the very positive story of this transition for many emerging economies. Last, just on public ownership, again, the history of how we built the fossil fuel system actually was full of lots of public ownership, and showed that that was a critical strategy to get over some of the risk hurdles, mobilize the capital, and deal with some of the coordination issues that Dani talked about. Whether that was publicly owned energy companies, utilities, transmission line companies, et cetera. And so again, I think in the move to clean energy, that same strategy has to be, or should be used in specific places. Whether GB Energy specifically is a good idea or not, I think that's TBD. There's still a lot of detail missing, from those ideas, but it's certainly a good debate to have. Thanks.
Thank you, Eric. So we'll go back to the room now for final comments from Simon, and then summing up from Angus. So Simon, please.
I'll just pick up two of the points. First of all, one from Alan. Lovely to hear Alan Kerman's on the line. For anyone who's not aware, he's one of the top thinkers in reimagining how the economy works. Alan, your question about how to deal with the parts of the transition that cause discomfort to the public. So I think there are two important things to recognize. One is that, as Eric's group of researchers at Oxford has pointed out, the transition overall is going to save a huge amount of money. By a rough calculation, 12 trillion between now and 2050, compared to carrying on burning fossils. So the overall challenge is not how to allocate the costs, it's how to allocate the savings. Where do you allocate those savings? Across time, across places, and across demographic groups. The second important thing to realize is that there are many sectors where the transition doesn't have to cause much inconvenience to people. You decarbonize the power sector in the UK 8 times faster than the global average, and most people haven't noticed. Road transport doesn't really have to be very difficult. EVs will be cheaper and faster and more reliable than petrol cars. energy intensive industries, it will be expensive for them to do, but it will make hardly any difference to consumers. Steel can be 50% more expensive to produce, but the cost of a car is only 1% more expensive as a result. So to consumers, that just doesn't matter. Probably the most invasive thing is to do with your own home. How do you heat it and how efficient does it have to be? So I think if you take those two things together, that actually we've got lots of savings to allocate from the transition, and there are only a small number of places where it's going to be really awkward for consumers. It says, well, really focus that money you've saved on making it easier for people in the places where otherwise they'd resist it. So home heating, I think I would whack some great big subsidies on that to make it a lot easier for everybody. The other question I think Adam directed at me was about GB Energy and National Wealth Fund, which I always find an amusingly ironic term in the UK, and the question of public ownership in general, an industrial strategy. I'll say two things about this. One, I want to be slightly cheeky and just say, I think the first thing Labour should do with GB Energy is buy up some nice gas power plants. And the reason I say that is we are decarbonising the power sector really fast, but it's going to be extremely difficult to get to zero emissions power by 2030 as the government wants to. One of the really hard parts of that is going to be keeping the small and decreasing amount of backup gas power that we will need if you don't want to have blackouts and a huge counter reaction against the transition. How do you keep those on the system when they're used less and less, and they become less and less profitable? Well, either you can pay some people in the private sector enormous amounts of money to tolerate investments with extremely low return, or you can just do that on a public budget. I think the public budget way gives you higher confidence and probably lower costs. So I would do that first. The second thing I would say is recalling what Dani was talking about earlier, the Tesla and Solyndra story, and which Mariana Mazzucato, also of this UCL empire, has told. Key points there are that public equity investment can be incredibly helpful, or the public investment can be incredibly helpful. If the government had taken an equity stake in Tesla, it would have been able to benefit from that and pay for loads of other similar investments. So I think there's a real role for public equity investments in clean technologies. And there's an under-recognized opportunity for government to do that at the same time as shaping the markets so that those investments, and of course the ones they're competing against in the same sectors, are successful. So a prime example of where we should be doing that is on long-term energy storage, where the technologies are desperately needed, not only in this country, but globally. We don't know yet which ones would be good. I would put a lot of public money into an equity fund there, make some good investments, and of course, create the markets for it at the same time.
Thank you very much, everybody. It falls to me to make a few summing up remarks. I'll be very brief because we run over time. I just want to answer one of the questions, the gentleman who asked about finance and whether we have a problem with the financial system. I just want to point out, you know, I'm old enough to remember when we used to have banks that look after specific sectors, like industrial banks and cotton banks and various other sectors, but we don't have them anymore. So there's going to have to be change in that area as well. We're not there yet. We're miles away. But can I, first of all, thank all of the speakers very much for excellent contributions. To my colleague, William, for he's the one who did all the organizing here, didn't do anything. And to Rehan, who's actually worked miracles to get all this technology so far to work pretty smoothly. So can I thank them all and the audience, the people who ask questions, because that's what really makes the discussion. Can I thank you all very much indeed. I'd also like to say that, you know, there's been a lot of grounds for optimism, which is very encouraging. I really like the idea of subsidy wars being a positive for developing countries. I mean, what a fantastic thing. But there, you know, I'm reminded of what Keynes said. It's not good ideas that are hard to find. It's leaving behind the old ideas, which are difficult. And I think we've still got a long way to go in this. 4 weeks ago, the Office of Budget Responsibility published a paper about what is the return from a 1% increase in government investment using an old production function that even 50 years ago, Paul Samuelson, the sort of leader of the Orthodox, said, don't use them. This is for parables. You shouldn't be using these for monetary and fiscal policy. 50 years later, we're still doing it. And not surprisingly, they find out almost no impact in the short term. That sort of thinking, of course, influences government. It's old thinking. And that's the area I think we have to leave behind. And that forces all of us to try and develop some of these analytical tools in order to facilitate this green transition. So thank you very much indeed for all taking part. And I hope you will join me in giving a round of applause to all of the speakers. Thank you.